On September 29th, 2008, the bottom fell out of the stock market in what would soon be known as the Great Recession, or the 2008 financial crisis, the most devastating economic downturn in a century. In a turn of remarkably horrifying events, the entire economic engine seemingly fell apart overnight. Millions of people lost their homes, trillions were lost from the stock market. Companies once thought to be rock solid dissolved into thin air overnight. It was a murderer's row of complete and total systemic failure. I had the nerve to ask my dad, a person who studies finance for fun, if you can believe that, about how bad it was only once. And what he said made my jaw drop. He, one of the firmest believers in the U.S. economy that I know, didn't know if it itself would survive. And it certainly seems like that was the case, looking back on it and being divorced from the issue. In the post-mortem of the Great Recession, many factors were to blame for this. The largest variable in the equation, the one that triggered all of the dominoes to cascade into one another, was the financialization of everything in our economy. Over the past century, we had increasingly gotten away from making things in America. Once a nation of builders, we had slowly but surely become a nation of service workers. And there's nothing wrong with service workers, by the way. I happen to be one of them, and most people in the workforce today, in some way, shape, or form, are. But there's something that happens to an economy when it stops to make things. There is no new innovation to replace the older, essential infrastructure of a society, the things that make everything work at a foundational level. Instead of a spirit of liveliness, a spirit of decay and decline begins to descend upon a culture. This hubris, this false belief that we were somehow better than those rubes of old who worked in factories and mills in favor of oppressive cubicles and fluorescent lighting, led to the favoring of different types of jobs and different types of work. With the large-scale adoption of cities and the suburbs, more people began to move towards centralized areas, further isolating the former workplaces of old from the biggest population centers in the country. Goodbye, Elyria, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana. Hello, Chicago, Illinois, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a massive shift, one of the biggest and definitely the most underreported in our country's past century. So the question we should ask is the following. What exactly caused this? What gave us the luxury of believing that we could abandon all of the things that got us to this point of being the most dominant nation on earth? How could we have possibly believed that we could simply fold up our old economy and jumpstart a new one completely and totally out of whole cloth? The answer to that question, when you look at it from a broad brushstroke, is simple and evident if you look hard enough. The financial industry. The biggest reason America believed it could outleverage its past as an industrial powerhouse is the rise of both the innovation and popularization of our financial sector. Once a boring and drab industry that focused its energy on counting basis points of interest rates and the amortization of loans, America's financial sector slowly but surely began to sink its teeth into every facet of our way of life. Soon, America's financial sector began to make everything in our economy about counting base points of interest rates and the amortization of loans. No longer did anyone have to bootstrap anything at all. They could just put it on credit. Proving your income to apply for a mortgage? What are you, a racist or something? Hire a financial literacy expert to teach young people how to manage their money responsibly? Nope, just mail them a Discover card, along with their non-bankruptcy eligible student loan from Fannie Mae. That'll take care of it. As the old saying goes, when you live by the sword, you also die by the sword. If you prosper because of an over-financialized economy, an over-leveraged economy, you will also be impoverished because of one. And this is exactly what happened in 2008. When the house of cards of the American banking system fell apart, particularly in the housing and subprime mortgage sectors, it triggered a minefield of other implosions. Housing, arguably the most important facet of American life, was ripped from Americans, leaving them to blow their entire lives up trying to recover. So what did this mean? Well, everything that wasn't a matter of survival went away. Vacation funds, eating out at restaurants, subscriptions to your favorite digital services, getting your car a daughter on her 16th birthday, the risk tolerance for taking the gamble on that startup you'd wanted to try for the past decade. Everything that wasn't about putting a roof over your head and food on your plate, particularly if you were responsible for a family, became secondary. This, as it turns out, is a massive problem in a consumerist and financialized economy like the United States of America. When the essentials are the only thing that matters, the rest of the economy, propped up by America's financial industry, imploded. Thousands of businesses shuttered. Their banking cohorts slowly followed suit, needing a bailout from the federal government to, quote, save the industry. And this, as it turns out, wasn't true. It only subsidized their irresponsibility and rewarded them for their malfeasance. The best encapsulation of the villainy of America's financial sector came from the best film and book about the 2008 financial crisis, The Big Short. In the film, Mark Baum, a hedge fund manager played by Steve Carell, is talking with his number two about dumping their shares of credit default swaps, or CDOs, which bet against the American housing market. They're now the most valuable financial instrument in the world, the only thing that was actually making money. Knowing their time is short, Baum's number two begs him to sell their swaps and to cash in, a number that would extend them into the billions. Before reluctantly doing so, Baum's haunting remarks made the world go silent. Quote, "I have a feeling that in a few years, people will be doing what they always do when the economy tanks. They'll be blaming immigrants and poor people." And that's exactly what happened. Instead of learning from their mistakes, instead of apologizing, more importantly, for what they did to predominantly middle and working class Americans, the people at the controls of these institutions of our federal government and banking system did the exact opposite. Instead, our ruling class, particularly in corporate America and politics, as mentioned, lectured them. "You should be grateful for us," they said. "We needed to be bailed out. How else would you be able to put your DoorDash order on credit? Can't afford a home? Why don't you just pull yourself up by their bootstraps? That's how we did it." All of these things were lies, and malicious lies, and harmful ones at that. However, even though this was blatantly and clearly the case, even though our elites had stated out loud that they hated the majority of America's citizens, enough to impoverish them and then rub their noses in it afterwards, this was never acted upon. No one paid any attention. Only one person, someone far from executive leadership, was punished. Instead, they were rewarded, showered with praise, and elevated further. Until their gravy train suddenly ran out. With the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the facts were in. Americans hated our ruling class. So much so that they had thumbed their nose adamantly at their implanted, more on that in a second, candidate Hillary Clinton, without remorse or regret. The confusion by our ruling class in the aftermath of the Trump election was vast and across all political spectrums. How could something like this have happened, they asked. But it turns out they didn't want to listen, because a total of 4 people, up to just about a few months ago, truly understood why the Trump election and our revolt against our elites has happened. Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, Victor Davis Hanson, and Vivek Ramaswamy. All 4 men, all who think very differently from different areas and walks of life, understood what really led to the rise of Donald Trump and why all of our implanted ruling class members were terrified of him, of what the divide was really about. Those who got better after the 2008 financial crisis versus those who got worse after it. And on its face, this is an astounding irony. All 4 of these men are, quote, conservatives, those who supposedly love the banks and the financial industry. But these 4 men didn't. And here are some examples. Bannon compared the Great Recession to, quote, neo-feudalism, where bombastic aristocrats seized ownership of everything from the citizenry. Carlson outed lobbyists and special interests left and right and the politicians they backed on his nightly Fox News show. Hanson insightfully noted that Trump was the only person of American political prominence to actively talk about America's noticeable decline, while our elites gloated over it and managed it. Ramaswamy exposed the grift of wokeness in corporate America as an astroturfed nothing burger, a hollow shell to, quote, atone for their sins in 2008. All 4 men were right, and all 4 men were hated because of it. However, alongside these 4 horsemen of the ruling class exposure, there were additional people that claimed the same messaging. The most notable position in the political sphere outside of Donald Trump that apparently had the problem with the financial services industry was Bernie Sanders. Sanders caught lightning in a bottle in 2016, taking aggrieved Occupy Wall Street clingers and morphing them into one of the most successful grassroots movements in modern political history, one which is still very much alive to this day. Sanders, an avowed socialist, talked about things that no Democratic candidate had dared to touch. He called for the confiscation of wealth from the top 1% of American earners. He wanted to cap interest rates on credit cards at 10% as a form of a usury law. One of his campaign slogans was, quote, billionaires shouldn't exist, which was cleverly adjusted to, quote, millionaires shouldn't exist, when Sanders himself was outed for owning 3 homes, one of which was on a beachfront property in his home state of Vermont. Establishment Washington hated Bernie Sanders for saying these things, but everyday Americans loved Bernie Sanders for saying these things. The reason why they loved him is that Bernie Sanders had a point, and a good one. While a wealth tax is blatantly anti-constitutional and wrong, someone was finally talking about action towards the massive gulf of income inequality that our ruling class had foisted upon our middle and working classes. Why are some credit cards, most of which are sent to students, allowed to have interest rates of 33%? Why do we think so highly of people just because of how much money they possess and how much interest rate arbitrages they can golf around? These are all good questions, and one that the American people had a right to ask. But lots can change in a decade. The biggest thing that has changed for Bernie Sanders is his relevancy. Once viewed as the future torchbearer of the Democratic Party by their voters, Sanders has now fallen in line with the people he supposedly hated. The second to last time we heard from him, he was screaming psychotically about a onesie he didn't like in Congress, while being outed by Bobby Kennedy after being one of the two largest recipients of donor money from pharma companies. Thank you for your service, Mr. Secretary. Most recently, he was seen riding first class to a series of rallies with his heir apparent Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called Fighting Oligarchy. Yes, you heard that right. If you are a top-performing, high-earning man in a corporate job, I have a free gift for you, the Value Economist Handbook. In this book, you will find a bulletproof, crystal clear, and step-by-step roadmap to build your values, systematize them into an unbeatable portfolio, and leverage them to create an unshakable identity that leads to fulfillment, meaning, and purpose. So, if you want a free copy, go down to the description below, fill out your information, and we'll send one over to you right away. Now, let's get back to today's video. We must ask again, why has this happened? Why is someone like Bernie Sanders, who supposedly took on the banks, the credit card companies, and corporate America with such vigor, on the outs right now with so many Americans? And to answer that question, we must acknowledge a truism about America. We love a true believer, but we hate a fraud even more. Be seen as one, and you'll be elevated. Be exposed as not being one, and you'll be destroyed. So the reason why Bernie Sanders has dropped out of his former position as the American left's foremost politician is, when you put it in that context, very simple. He's a plant. Bernie Sanders, for all his talk of the opposite, has been installed by our ruling class to spread a narrative. He's not a true believer. In fact, he doesn't believe in anything. Well, anything that doesn't benefit him directly, at least. Bernie Sanders and people like him are plants, put in their position of influence by greater power brokers that poison our discourse with an agenda that only serves them. A plant, simply put, is an isolated person pretending to be a certain type, but is completely beholden and dependent on outside actors for survival. A houseplant would die, for example, if a human didn't place it in a pot, water it, and put it in sunlight to grow. Much the same for our cultural plants today. Even though they may look on their faces like they're a part of a broader ecosystem, that they belong with the rest of their kind, they are just a curated, Instagram filter, X#friendly counterfeit of the real thing. Cat Williams' now immortalized appearance on Club Shay Shay, we're going to talk about him next week, by the way, was the first big bombshell when it came to exposing the plants across our culture. Williams named names, such as John Cena, of people who were controlled by behind-the-scenes actors. Puppet masters in the music business, for example, pay predominantly black artists to make widely popular music about killing and selling drugs to predominantly black people. If you're a comedian, you can be funny, but if you try to slay our sacred cow, you're canceled. Make a movie that calls out human trafficking and sexual perversion, and you can't even get an interview on Good Morning America. Williams' antics on Shannon Sharpe's show weren't just hyperbolic, they were prophetic. There is a simultaneous cultural collapse and cultural revival happening in America. Thankfully, the culture that Williams called out is dying, and their narratives along with it. And this is an overwhelmingly good thing, because that culture is a culture of death. It's demonic. It's evil. It has already had too long in the sun. That culture and the plants that grow within it needs to be uprooted and fast. In that same interview, Cat Williams declared 2024 as, quote, the year of truth. Everyone would be exposed, he said. No one would be able to hide anything anymore. It would all come out. We would all know who the installed people were, who all the plants were, who all the people running things actually were, and what they actually wanted. The purpose of plants in our ruling class and around our ruling class is to spread a narrative on behalf of another more powerful party. They're tools designed to instigate propaganda to ensure some other group maintains power, pressure, and profits over another. The reason why so many people are so misled now is because they're getting spoon-fed a non-existent social dilemma of which the current destructive narrative, spindling out from our culture of death, has led us. These narratives aren't necessarily wrong, even though they are much more than that. They're harmful, and deliberately so. We're going to be discussing a lot of these today, some of which will ruffle a lot of feathers, but they are much needing to be ruffled, because these plot lines must be disrupted. A society is as good as its stories allow it to be. If you tell bad stories, you will get a bad society. To root out bad stories, you must root out the bad storytellers along with them.